Yes, in the pit. The standers who were down there would pay a penny, and they would really be people like apprentices who could afford no more, but they would also include pickpockets. I mean, the ideal place is to be at a sporting arena where you could be filching people's pockets, and similarly, that's what would happen there. And prostitutes, of course, would ply their trade there. And up in the galleries, some of the aristocrats would have their little booths, almost private rooms. And behind those, there would be other rooms. So if they weren't enjoying the play and a courtesan was there, they would pop into the back room to have a 10 or 15 minutes of business with the courtesan and come back for the last act. That was quite normal.
And they also had vendors selling...
Vendors selling beer, vendors selling food, vendors selling all sorts of things, and that was a dangerous thing for the actors, because if they weren't giving a good performance and someone was suddenly handed something they were eating, they would throw it. Another problem was, and people don't realize this, that on the stage of the Globe Theatre or any other theatre of the day, a wealthy person could actually buy a seat to be put on the side of the stage, which reduced the acting area and blocked out the vision of people behind, but allowed actors like Burbage to have a lot of eye contact with ladies who came and sat down there. And like my character, Lawrence Firethorn, they were great womanizers, and they would set up assignations with these ladies. You have to remember, actors had the most enormous success. There were sumptuary laws, as you know, in Elizabethan England, which meant that only certain members of the aristocracy could wear certain rich clothing. You began with the king, obviously, then you had the royal dukes, then you had the dukes, then you had the earls, then you had the baronets, and so on. And each one was entitled to wear ermine, then you sort of came down, they were entitled to wear silks. So the ordinary people could only wear
the drab.
the absolute drab things. Now, the actors got away with murder because they could wear anything. And they would come onto a stage wearing a cloak which cost £40. Now, if you multiply that by a factor of at least 100 and possibly 1,000, you see how expensive that is. And that would be more than they would earn in the whole year. But they would get to wear a cloak which would be handed down to them, usually by their patron, who would wear it at court 4 or 5 times and then hand it on to the company. And at one point, one of the great, I think it's Burbage, is on tour and writes back to his wife and says, "Sell my second best cloak, because we are short of money," knowing full well that would bring in £5 or £10, which was an enormous amount of money in those days.
Which also meant that Nicholas, in addition, pardon me, to keeping the book, the costumes and so forth were an important resource.
Very much so.
For the company, and they were kept in chests and had to be carefully guarded. They
had to be very carefully guarded and taken on tour there. Of course, they did all the plays in modern dress. People don't realize this. When Shakespeare is now performed in doublet and hose, that was their normal modern dress. And when they played a play like Julius Caesar, they wouldn't do the whole thing. They would simply put on a toga over that, and if they were doing a play which required armor, they'd simply clip on the armor. So they made no attempt for total verisimilitude. They wouldn't go to a costume place and hire something which was identical to the armor worn, say, in the Battle of Agincourt. They couldn't afford to do that, frankly.
And many of the plays were actually performed in inns, which were ideal because there was a courtyard, and then there would be the galleries leading to the rooms. And in fact, you have chosen to name the books in your Shakespearean, or pardon me, in your Elizabethan theater series after English pubs.
Mostly after English pubs. The first one is the Queen's Head, and they perform at the Queen's Head. And the Queen's Head is the Queen's Head in many senses. It begins with the beheading of one Queen's Head, that's Mary Queen of Scots, which was in 1587. Then we go to the performance at the Queen's Head, which is the basic venue of My People. Right. That's in Gracechurch, and Gracechurch Street, and there was a famous inn there in Gracechurch Street that was used for performance. The problem there was that they were within the City of London and therefore came under the jurisdiction of the City of London, so they could not perform on a Sunday. It was illegal. Whereas the theatres proper, and there were 3 at that particular time, the theatre, as it was called in Shoreditch, the Curtin in Shoreditch, and the Rose Theatre in Bankside, which is in Southwark, south of the river. Those 3 being outside the City of London weren't under its jurisdiction. They could perform 7 days a week.
Well, there were some hazards, too, with the inns for fire, for example, which comes into one of your books. Yes. The landlord at your inn, who is the lugubrious chap at best, is always distraught at, you know, the thought of fire and whatever, but on the other hand, he finds it difficult to resist the income from having these assemblages come in to his inn. They're also subject to weather because the courtyard is not under cover. So, and then you've already mentioned the plague, which twice, the trip to Jerusalem and the Fair Maid of Bohemia sends your company. And in the one in which Nicholas goes west, was it plague that actually sent him?
No, it wasn't the plague, it was a fire, in fact. What happened there was they had an effect on stage, and people don't realize how elaborate some of these effects were. They had gunpowder, you see, so when they had a battle, whenever it says alarms and excursions, they'd set off some gunpowder below the stage. You had this great bang, and they'd have cymbals, and they'd have drums, and so on. And on this occasion, they have a fire on stage, because there's a devil figure, and the wind blows the fire, and the fire goes up the wall and hits the thatch.
That's right.
And of course this actually happened to the Globe Theatre, which was burned to the ground, Shakespeare's own Globe. What we see is a reconstruction of the second Globe Theatre. And my inn is not destroyed, but it's so badly burned that they can't perform there, and therefore they have no venue. The only thing they can do is to go on tour. And because Nicholas has other reasons for getting to the West Country, which is where he comes from Barnstaple. Nicholas, of course, is the son of a merchant, and there's a very kind of hazy background in the earlier books. We don't quite know why he's come into the theatre. We do know that he went with Drake on the circumnavigation of the world, which is that extraordinary thing that took place in the 1570s, which took the best part of 3 years. And in The Silent Woman, I explain exactly retrospectively why he went and why he's the sort of person he is, and it gave me a wonderful excuse to run the theatrical story parallel with the personal story of him, and to delve into the local history of Devon, North Devon, which is where Barnstaple is. And I had some wonderful time, because Devon is a particularly well-served thing by its libraries, and the local history that I dug up there was absolutely fascinating.
And you also wanted to derail Nicholas's romance
with
Anne Hendricks, who is the widow of a Dutch hat maker,
yes,
and is herself, he's a lodger
yeah,
in Anne Hendricks' house. And you know, it's a chronic problem, as you've often said, with mystery writers. If you have them in too settled a romance, you lose some momentum in the story. So you needed a complication in this relationship.
It is a problem. Colin Dexter, who writes the Inspector Morse, once said to me that the reason he's never given Morse a wife is that, he said, if you give someone a wife, all they can do is talk about what paper you put in the living room, you know, or what new carpet you're going to buy. Unless the wife or the partner is involved in the investigative process, it's very difficult. Now, Anne is not involved in the investigative side, although I do use her sometimes as a foil for Nicholas.
Right.
And it seemed to be a nice time to just complicate the relationship slightly and take him outside and involve him with another lady from his past, which made things interesting. And then, of course, he came back expecting that Anne would pick up with him, and as you know, I won't give the story away, that is not quite what happens. And
you got something of a storm of protest, didn't you?
I had a storm of protest, especially from Arizona, but that's another story. What I should say, Barbara, of course, is that the major problem I have is that with a repertoire of 30 or 40 plays, as these companies would have, I could not use existing plays. I'm very careful not to get up to beyond 1595, 96 when Shakespeare came along, because I have to write the plays that they perform. And very often the title of the play is the title of my book, so The Merry Devils is the name of the play. And I had to work out the 5-act play that was The Merry Devils and write the dialogue, parts of the dialogue, to give an impression of how it goes. And in fact, with that novel, some woman wrote to me from Chicago and she said, you know, you've got this wrong, you've misquoted this play. That doesn't happen. As I remember it, this is what should happen. And of course, I'd invented the play completely. And she was very flummoxed when I wrote back and said, I'm sorry, but you know, this is my play that I wrote and I know what happens.
You have a book that's particularly dear to me called The Mad Courtesan, which involves a performing horse?
Yes, a performing horse. It involves many things, one should say, and don't be modest about this, Barbara, that the dedicatee is a certain Barbara Peters of the Poisoned Pen, whom I referred to as the Countess of Scottsdale at the beginning of that. And it's called The Mad Courtesan because it begins with a death in the arms of a courtesan in a part of London. So we know who the murderer is at the start, and then we go on. And there's a parallel story involving this wonderful horse, as you say. And when I sent the book in to my editor, he loved them, and there are 4 or 5 other stories, as you know, supporting the main one. He said, I love everything, but I just can't believe this thing about the horse getting to the top of St. Paul's Cathedral. It was impossible. So I said, well, why don't you walk to your fax machine and just stand by for 5 minutes? And I faxed him through a facsimile of a playbill of somebody who in 1602 had a performing horse which went to the top of St. Paul's Cathedral. And this man did it. How he did it, nobody knows. Because it's very easy to make a horse go forward, and I've got 11 horses, and you know, I know how the problem we have getting horses into horse boxes. But getting them to come out of a horse box and to come backwards, which they would have to do, or to get them go down a winding staircase, is an enormous problem. And I think I managed to explain it in the book, but it was a lovely kind of comic story.